Well, welcome everyone to the AI in healthcare discussion. I'd like to try to make this a more interactive discussion. And so we're going to be asking for questions throughout the presentation. We'll also be available after the presentation for more discussions. But we want to keep this kind of informal and interactive, or it's going to be another long session. So we really hope that we get some participation. So let's do some quick introductions. But before we get into the content, I just want to set the stage for what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about practical applications today. We're not going to talk about theory. We're not going to talk about a lot of the kind of nitty-gritty architecture details. We're going to talk about how you can practically apply artificial intelligence and machine learning, primarily for automation in the healthcare industry. So with that, I'll just introduce myself quickly. I work for PwC. My name is Matt Rich. And I focused on digital and technology innovation in healthcare. So that's my focus. And I brought Sid with me today, as well as JR, to talk through some of the real examples.
Quick introduction, Sid Bhattacharya. I work in PwC's technology consulting practice, and I primarily focus in healthcare AI space. And over the last couple of years, I've been working with JR and Matt here, working on a very interesting project that we're going to be talking more about later today. So that's me.
Hi, my name is J.R. Birch. I'm an IT leader at Eli Lilly, a pharmaceutical firm based in the Midwest, and been working with PwC on some exciting projects here in the AI space.
Thanks, guys.
One thing we forgot is the clicker.
Let's see if it works.
It works.
All right. So we'll just spend maybe 2 minutes talking about how, when we think about AI in healthcare from a PwC perspective, how do we approach it? So Sid, why don't you take us through that?
Yeah. So as Matt mentioned, just want to spend a few minutes before we get into the details on how we think about AI at PwC. AI is a buzzword now, but we at PwC, we've been focused on AI for quite some time now. We made our first investment in setting up our own AI labs approximately a decade ago. And the way we approach AI is two things in mind. One, our core motto is do unto ourselves what we would recommend to our clients. So that's what we're going to be talking about in this slide, is how we do things to ourselves before we actually bring it to our clients in the healthcare space and outside. And the second thing is, we are here for the healthcare clients. So whatever, we understand the business problems and we bring it in-house and do our proof of concepts on them. So just getting into the details here, the first thing that we do is around strategy and research. We have a team of data scientists, data engineers focused on understanding what's the latest and greatest when it comes to AI. And the benefit of this is we stay ahead of the market. So we know what's coming up, what are the new modeling approaches, what are the new deployment approaches. And then we also, this team also helps us design experiments. We design proof of concepts, we understand what's coming up, and we design experiments to prove hypotheses. So that's what this team does. The second team that we have in place is around our labs. So we take the strategy and research work that's been done in the AI space with a focus on practical AI. And I can't stress this enough. So we are not just a bunch of data scientists who just go and build models. We look at the entire AI lifecycle, like all the way from ingestion, modeling, down to how you deploy, package these models in an enterprise setting. So that's very critical, and that's an often missed part about AI deployments. We only focus on the data scientists. So we look at it from an entirety. The POCs that we run, approximately, it says 30 to 40 POCs annually in the healthcare space, which prove out these advanced concepts. And the last, and definitely not the least team that we have, is around delivery. Once we do our research, once we prove out the concepts internally, we have a very strong delivery team that we are very proud of. We have people in the team who are product leaders, who understand AI, who understand how to break down a customer problem and map it to an AI solution. We have people who are excellent engineers, who can build back-end infrastructure, who can build the data platform, the analytics platforms that go with it. We have super data scientists who can obviously build the models. And then we have excellent UI people, people who can design the right experiences, who can actually bring it to life. So that's how we think about AI. And We're going to talk about more about this later, but when we started the journey with Eli Lilly back in 2016, AI wasn't as big as it's now. It was still a twinkle in someone's eyes. So this is the approach that we took. We came up, we worked with the team here, we identified the business question we wanted to answer, and we then did our own research, we did our own proof of concept, and then we brought it to delivery. So that's how we work. One more slide, I promise, before we get into the actual stuff, is this is our key areas of focus when it comes to AI. And you can see it goes all the way from standard machine learning models to like automated ML to data engineering and model ops, the thing that I was talking about, making sure that we have the right pipeline in place. And something else that I want to do a quick plug for here is responsible AI. This is a very new framework. If you guys have not checked it out, please do so. Where PwC, we are really driving the market and trying to mature the market around making sure we are responsible with AI, making sure that we have AI which is bias-free, making sure we have AI that is more equitable. So we are pushing the frontiers here, and it's very important when you talk about the healthcare environment where it's highly audited. We have the FDA and other regulatory bodies working, looking at us. So responsible AI, please look at it. That's my quick sales pitch on PwC. For those of you who missed us, we are the greatest thing ever. Please work with us.
So now let's kind of move forward into the example we want to talk about for about 20 minutes. So this is the example of a real life application. I think we've been in production for about 2.5 years now, and we are completing our 4th release. So this is something where we've had a chance to learn, understand what works and what doesn't. And JR is going to take us through some of that journey and what the value has been.
Yeah, so again, as I said, my name is JR Birch. I do work for Eli Lilly and Company. I'm an IT leader and actually the IT lead for this particular project that we engaged with PwC on, really focused on our pharmacovigilance and patient safety space, sometimes referred to as drug safety, where we implemented artificial intelligence and intelligent automation to actually streamline a lot of our processes and make the process much more efficient for us. So over the next few minutes, I'm going to take us through really the approach that we used with PwC and other partners to execute, an overview of the solution, and also touch on some of the high-level conceptual architecture. I'm also going to hit on the business benefits that we've experienced, real business benefits that we've experienced, and then leave you with some key recommendations and things to consider if you're looking at doing something like this. But before I get into those details, I wanted to pause and recognize not everyone may know what pharmacovigilance is. So just by a show of hands, who knows what pharmacovigilance is? All right, and my bed's in the front row here, thank you. All right, so just for those that don't know, really very simply put, pharmacovigilance is really the science relating to collection, detection, assessment, and monitoring, and ultimately preventing adverse effects or events for patients that are taking medicines, right? So all pharmaceuticals are required to have some sort of pharmacovigilance practice. And actually, by regulation, we also report every adverse event that we become aware of. And all pharmaceuticals are obligated to do that by regulation. But ultimately, trying to really prevent adverse effects and events from happening. Just to define and give you an example of what an adverse event may be, pretty simplistic. You're taking a medicine and you experience an adverse event like a headache, a rash, an upset stomach, something that you did not expect to get by taking the medicine. That is coined an adverse event and is reportable to the regulators. So just to kind of give you some background, I think as Sid mentioned, back in 2016, we engaged with PwC and worked on some strategy work because we saw that we were really facing a challenge with the volume of adverse events that we were receiving, experiencing a growth of over 10% year over year of our volume. And we currently deal with about 250,000 adverse events every year. And this is not unexpected. I mean, we are driving some of this volume as well as we run things like patient support programs, right? So as patients take our medicines, we engage with them to make sure that they're having a good experience, right? And in that interaction, we actually typically will sometimes get adverse events reported to us in that conversation. So that inherently raises volume. We also acknowledge that we continue to use connected devices in our clinical trials and aftermarket trials, and receiving that information as well as a new data source for us, inherently increasing our volume. And really the third and biggest is new product releases, right? So adding to the existing products that are already out on the market, releasing new products increments your volume. So it's a challenge that we knew we needed to address. So we worked with PwC over really a 5-year roadmap, determining a strategy of how we wanted to go about addressing that and getting alignment to addressing these adverse events versus many other priorities that we could have chosen. So I think, as Matt mentioned, we've been working on this for approximately 2 years. And we've got a system in production that's really transformed the way that we are doing pharmacovigilance at Lilly. So on this slide is really our from to, from our current state on the left and then future state on the right. And really what this is showing is, in pharmacovigilance, we're typically working with a user base that are medical professionals, right? They're usually registered nurses, pharmacists, or registered medical doctors that are working with this information. And the way the process works now is we are required to collect all of that data no matter how it comes in, right? So patients can call us through the call center. We have a transcribed call. Doctors can send us scanned medical records that we then have to get information out of. Doctors can send us handwritten notes that we then also have to look at and understand, as well as email and other things that are coming in. So point there being very diversified data sources that we have to deal with. And then we're asking those medical professionals to really do that kind of sometimes physical paper shuffling, emailing, phone calls, things that, they're not necessarily, they didn't go to medical school or nurse school to do those things, right? So we're asking them to kind of do that lower value work. So we want to get them out of that business and help them focus on what they're good at and what they've been trained at. So what we've implemented on the right is something that we refer to at Lilly as Mosaic PV. And really what that is at its heart is use of artificial intelligence, intelligent automation, and a custom UI for those medical professionals to make their jobs more streamlined and much more efficient. Like we mentioned, we're currently in our actually third release, and we've been in production for over 18 months. We're actually being used globally in the US, Canada, Brazil, and India. So on this slide, I wanted to kind of take you through just a high-level conceptual architecture of what we've implemented for our team. And it really consists of 4 high-level components from left to right. The first one being that ingest layer that you see. The second one being the read and recognize. Third being interpret. And fourth really being that user interface piece. So just to spend a little bit of time on the ingest. So we do pull, like I mentioned, information from several different sources, and we really land that in an AWS-based data lake in a raw store. We then do some transformation on that to put it in a structure that the solution can work with. And after that step, we apply kind of that read capability. And really all that is a combination of NER, named entity recognition, as well as natural language processing engines on that to really pull out those key entities from that unstructured text that we're interested in. So those are things like patient name, reporter name, the actual name of the drug, and the event itself, all key pieces of information for us. And then we move that into really that interpret piece, which then applies really machine learning models to that information to do some things like determine seriousness. Seriousness is an aspect of a case that really dictates to us what timelines we need to follow when we become aware of that adverse event and need to report it to the regulator. So a very important aspect of processing a case. And an example could be, like I mentioned before, a headache may not be as serious as a hospitalization event, right? So hospitalization indicating typically always serious. From the time we become aware of it to the time we need to get it to the regulator, and any regulator across the globe is typically, I think, 7 days. So a pretty quick timeline to do that processing. And we're using machine learning models to help with that determination. And then that fourth piece, that user interface piece, really, as we talked about, we needed to customize an experience for the user that gave them what they needed to know when they needed it, right? Very tailored to them, so they could do their jobs much faster and free them up from kind of those manual, lower value activities that I mentioned before. And then as a final step, once they've done that and they've verified the information, we send it on to what we call our safety database. And really what that is an application that houses all those complicated reporting rules to tell us where to send those adverse event cases throughout the globe to the different regulators. So with that, I think we wanted to pause a little bit for some
questions. So just a couple of points I think are relevant. When JR talked about the volume, there's 250,000 adverse events that grow at about a 10% rate each year. About 90% of those are not new. So it's things that everybody's seen before. They're well-characterized, well-defined events. So do you want to be taking your medical professionals' time to look at the 90% that you know about, or do you want to focus them on the 10% that are of interest or are unique? That's the real advantage here. You can focus the people's time on things that are adding value. It's not just about automation for automation's sake. It's really about focusing these high-value resources, highly skilled resources on things that are going to challenge them and add value to the company. I mean, that's the bottom line here, is we're saving time and we're saving money, but we're also giving people much better jobs, right? They're focusing on things that are important to them. So we did want to pause here and ask for questions. We'll ask different times for the presentation, but any questions about what we're presenting? Go ahead.
Yeah, so how do biases and being careful that you're not overstepping decisions and current bias that can hinder regulator work in this sort of model? I don't sort of see the normal step that would be there for audit trail.
Yeah, so I'll start, and then you guys can add if that's all right. So can you go to the mic right behind you? That'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, so my question is I don't see how in this diagram you account for bias or any sort of decisions you're making automatically, and how that might be a negative decision according to auditors or regulators.
Yeah, so good question. So what we do actually, so first of all, we've always got a human in the loop. So as I mentioned, we are actually interacting with that medical professional through the application, and they're making changes on the suggestions that they see in front of them. So ultimately, they make the final decision, and it will be that way for the foreseeable future. So that's that. But we also, for the ML models, we actually used our own data, right? So our own Lilly data that our medical professionals have been processing for some time, for a number of years, to actually train those models. So a lot of what we're seeing as the outputs express really our own Lilly biases that we know that may or may not be there, right? So we're adjusting constantly as we see those suggestions from Mosaic actually suggested back to them. Did that help? Yeah, good.
And just to add on to that, the audit trail part, this is a conceptual architecture, but audit trail is maintained at the field level in the system. So we know exactly what the system recommended. We know exactly what the human provided feedback on, so we can compare and contrast. So it's a very, very thorough audit trail in here.
Great question.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Please.
One more.
So you mentioned in the old world, right, you get handwritten notes from doctors, and then you mentioned a custom UI, and I see digital sources. Can you talk about the decision then to say, I need to change the behavior of my physicians upstream versus let me build a model to interpret their handwritten notes and do everything?
Yeah, so we haven't dealt with handwriting just yet. We do receive them. Unfortunately, that's still a manual process. And actually, the technology specifically, I think that's ICR, I believe, to interpret that handwriting is still fairly immature because it's widely variable. And what was the second part of your question? Sorry.
It was just about the decision trade-off. Is I want to try and change their behavior and make them come to a custom portal instead of just giving me a note like this.
Yeah, so that leads us to something we have on our roadmap actually, which we've called digital intake, but to actually have more of a direct, web and mobile portal for the physician, for the patient, to report that more directly. So that is in our future at some point. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, unfortunately, we have to accept whatever they want to give us. It
Right.
accounts for far less than 1% of the volume, which is nice as far as handwriting, but it's still something you have to deal with.
Yep.
Any other questions?
Oh.
We completely bored the whole left half of the room. These two.
That's what happens when you have a session right after lunch.
Okay.
I have a couple of questions, JR, just to get the conversation going. As we implemented this at Eli Lilly, and from an outside-in perspective, what were some of the key challenges or some of the key learnings from your point of view?
Yeah, I think, a couple of the big ones that I'll mention just right off the top and something that's actually been emphasized this week, which was nice, is we did take a top-down approach. We mentioned that strategy work early on where we got alignment with our kind of VP level leaders to determine where we're going to prioritize our efforts and what problems or challenges we wanted to address. Once we did that, we got their buy-in on this being a big challenge that we wanted to really commission a team and resources and spend money to actually solve for us. So that was number one, getting that buy-in, which enabled most other things to happen. And then secondly, those same leaders, I would say, really empowered and challenged us to do what we needed to do to solve the problem or bring a solution forth. And it sounds small, but that was really pretty big. I mean, as far as I know, we're still one of the few, if not the only, pharma that has this type of solution in production. And there are a lot of reasons for that. Just being pharmaceuticals risk adverse, being especially in the patient safety space, also an additional layer of risk there. But this is something that no one had done at the time. I think we even actually put some of the initial concepts out there. It was interesting as we were going through procurement processes, actually getting the concepts that we put forth in our documentation out, asking for bids, coming back to us, right? So that was fun. But really, they empowered us to figure it out, even though none of us really knew, how, right? So that was exciting and motivating. And that was actually a very big portion for us as well.
Cool. One other question around AI versus RPA. Back when we started the journey, RPA was a thing. Why didn't we pick RPA, and why did we have to go to machine learning technology?
Yeah. So as we looked at RPA, I mean, RPA is more targeted towards those repeatable processes where they're the same steps every time, much like like a finance transaction. You've got to go through steps 1 through 5, and they're the same each time. Whereas in our space, you do require that medical training, that clinician training. There is a lot of judgment there, and it's not really a good candidate for those very repeatable processes. Right, so that's why I'd say, RPA really wasn't an option for us.
Yeah, anytime you have to make decisions or judgments, RPA just is not going to give you that level of accuracy.
Mm-hmm.
So, one question: does this entire analysis go back to physician?
Can you speak a little? closer.
So does this analysis go back to the physician, or is there some process that helps the physician in the end to make better decisions in recommending medicines?
You want to take that, Sid?
So as far as does the information get back to a physician where they can kind of adjust?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so the whole practice of pharmacovigilance is for a company to understand if there's new things that are happening to patients that they need to take a different dosage, they should maybe stop using the medication, they should use a different type of therapy. So the whole idea here is to protect the patient. And as soon as something new is found out, there's a long analysis that's conducted to say, maybe people of this genotype shouldn't be taking this medication. So a lot of the truly new learnings are fed back into the process internally to try to separate out those patients that might be harmed. So that's kind of the internal process, and then obviously the regulators get the same type of information. So they understand, hey, we should be monitoring these type of patients and not let them take the drug. But great question. So we're just about the halfway mark. We wanted to kind of get the interaction going a little bit more. So what we've done is we have randomly placed a certificate for a very cool prize under someone's chair. So if you can take your right or your left hand, look under your chair, do not pull off the label for the chair. It might feel like that. And whoever has that very special ticket, please let us know. Ufat, there he is, the winner.
Wow.
Thank you. And thank you for not pulling off the chair label.
Yep.
Can we go back? I had two questions. One,
Sure.
Let's take the easier one probably first. How did you validate your models?
How do we validate our
Yeah.
models? So very much like we do system code today, right? So essentially, and I assume that's what you mean by validation. So in a validation context for me, we're in a regulated space, right? We move it through a dev, QA, test, and production release, and we document our results, right?
Well, I mean, did you run your model in parallel with your existing manual process and send, events through both to see if they ended up in the same place? Is that what you did, or how did you, more directly like that?
No, so what we did was, we shot for, I think it was mid to high 80s kind of accuracy results, knowing that we would have, those medical professionals reviewing the outcomes. And then, like I said, we used our own data, which those same medical professionals were actually created and actually helped us annotate to train those models.
So your slide says, was it this one? So it's about assisting with the automation, right?
Correct.
So is it providing that manual intervention guidance on what should be the next step in the workflow, or is it actually jumping them to that next point in the workflow?
It provides a recommendation on
Okay.
what would be the next point of the workflow.
Okay. All right. And so one other question, if you don't mind. So going back, so you mentioned, I think you said that only 1% of your information from the providers was in some sort of manual format, which I almost fell out of my chair when I heard that.
And handwriting.
Handwriting.
Yeah, whereas when I work with those in the industry or work with the agencies, it's almost the direct opposite.
Yeah.
So how is it that you were able to get physicians to do that high level of digital compliance versus when, say, the government tries to even incentivize them and pay them more, but yet there's that barrier of adoption to digital supply data?
I think that over time, handwriting has reduced very significantly because they use really high technologies like fax. So they might type something.
Right, yeah.
So we still get a lot of faxes.
Oh, yeah.
We get a lot of PDFs, we get emails. So they've still used maybe a little bit archaic type of means, but they've switched now to those text-based versus handwritten-based methods of reporting adverse events. So it's not all roses, believe me, but at least it's not all handwriting.
Good question.
Good question. Any others? Let's talk about some numbers.
All right. Numbers. So pretty simple here. So what have we achieved? We actually set a goal of 25% in reduction of duration of processing, and as you can see there, that's a 75% number. So we really blew it out of the water. We thought, like I said, we didn't know if it was possible when we started. We didn't know what the results would be, and we felt 25% was pretty aggressive, actually. But we were pleasantly surprised with the outcomes of what we saw. A lot of that was due to just integrating some systems as well, some basic automation that came into play, in addition to the AI that we put in place. All that together really resulted in a much larger impact than we ever predicted. And that's that kind of that end-to-end cycle time, right? So I mentioned, from the time of awareness to reporting, that's what that 75 number represents. Additionally, greater than 30% reduction in the actual time that's spent by that medical professional on that particular case, right? So a case is not constantly touched, every single day. Sometimes it sits in a queue and then gets picked back up to move it through the workflow. So that number really represents the actual time that medical professional spent processing. So this is a big success story for us at Lilly. Obviously leads to a lot of cost savings for us and cost avoidance specifically. And most important part of it is that really that experience that our team has had, those medical professionals, working in the system, lots of positive feedback about how we've changed really their jobs for them, making it easier, and really focusing them back on, what they were trained to do and more of that higher value work. So it's been a great story for us. A few other things, Sid had asked me a couple of top lessons learned, a few other things that thoughts of consideration I'd leave you with as well. We recognized as part of that empowerment really that we needed to work very differently. So we were very accustomed to, kind of working in separate teams, finance, quality, IT, business, and even with, different vendor teams as well, kind of handing stuff off to each other. So we recognized that we couldn't achieve what we wanted to do by working that way. So we really set up a concept, myself and our senior business partner, that we ended up calling Mosaic 1. But it was really just a concept to pull the team together and unify. In addition to giving it a nice brand or a name, we also associated some key behaviors that we were looking for from the team and from a unified team across those functions I mentioned at Lilly, but also involving our partners like PwC and others as one single team. We wanted to stress things like, don't have the hallway meetings, right? Don't go sit at a meeting, stay silent, and not voice your opinion, and then go talk about it after you leave the meeting, right? Let's have it out in the meeting, keep it professional, have a spirited debate, but come to a conclusion and a set of actions right then and there, right? Saving you time and really building trust, right, amongst one another to get work done. And there were some other key behaviors that we asked the team to consider and really pushed and drove across us. And that was a big key differentiator for us and something that we were held up for internally as well as an example for others to work. A couple more things. We did work in an agile fashion, right? We did truly focus on a minimal viable product when we started. We sliced off a piece of scope that would still deliver, significant business value, but keep it small, right? Because like I said, nothing existed out there. We built something from scratch. So we wanted to give ourselves focus to really build that foundation first and iterate, right, in a Scrum fashion to make sure that we were learning quickly, right? And we learned quite a few things. We all learned together too, which kind of brought us even closer and built that trust, which was nice. Also, AI is, there were at that time some preconceived notions that it was kind of Armageddon and the machines are taking over, right? That kind of attitude. And we kind of ran into some of that with, being in the regulated industry and that sort of thing. But we just kind of talked through it and we educated folks on what's really happening. What does a machine learning model look like? What's it actually doing? And once you kind of explain that it's a set of numbers and making adjustments based upon those numbers and observations, raising that level of comfort. And actually, attending reInvent last year, I had the opportunity to sit in a deep racer lab and actually go through that. That analogy was very helpful for me to bring back to our stakeholders and to really explain how machine learning works and the concept of the car adjusting itself on the track. And really comes close to home for us, Lilly being based in Indianapolis, Indy 500. A lot of people kind of relate to the racing analogy, so that was very helpful. And like I mentioned before, our machine learning models are not running autonomously, adjusting themselves in production. Like I mentioned, we always have a human in the loop, and will probably be that way for the foreseeable future. So that was another degree of kind of check and comfort build for our stakeholders as well. So with that, I think I'll hand it back to you guys.
Any questions on the numbers before we get into some other use case examples? Please.
So the AI machine learning are pretty wide in scope. When you say you have rule-based models in the interpretation step, can you explain a little more in detail on the model side?
Rule-based models? So your question is about the rules?
No, so are you using like neural networks or traditional statistical models?
Oh, go ahead.
Yep, we have a slide on that just coming up. If you don't mind just pinning your question, we'll definitely get to that. I had just one other thing, as Matt mentioned. We have built the solution. It's been in production for a while, but we recently moved to the cloud. Like over the last 6 months or so, we moved to AWS cloud, and we are seeing a lot of benefits. And JR, feel free to add in here. One of the primary benefits of the cloud that we are seeing is the business agility side, right? We are able to do things much faster. Like the entire CI/CD pipeline, which would take us a long time to deploy, is being done in hours now. Mm-hmm. Anything else from your side, JR, on the cloud side?
Yeah, actually, as a lot of my partners sit in the front row here, I mean, we actually use this project to drive really qualification and trailblazing implementation of a lot of AWS services, not only for our use, but then for the wider enterprise, right? So now that, kind of Mosaic, that project trailblazed that path, we did a lot of the work to stand those services up, figure out the different security rails that we had to put in place and configurations and documentation, being in that regulated industry. But now that's something that many other project teams and efforts and functions at Lilly are able to take advantage of. So that was a big deal for us.
And I just would add, when we switched from the previous architecture to a fully cloud-native architecture, the performance that the users experienced was dramatically improved. They were sometimes waiting a couple seconds for them to get to a new field or for them to be able to enter information. Now it's down to double-digit milliseconds, right? That's a very significant and very big improvement. Like, they're happy now. Before, they were giving us questions about, well, why is this slow? This is supposed to be modern technology, and now we're down to the point where there's no more issues with performance. So it's been a very, very positive shift.
Another area was cost too, right, JR?
Absolutely. Yeah, we had significant, what we refer to as base cost savings, but essentially that installed base that we have in place, reducing that, because for us that's direct operational expense hits. So that was a big advantage as well, taking that cost out of the equation.
So let's start to talk about some other use cases. So we've deployed this now into the cloud. We've got this pipeline that handles the automation.
Do you have a question?
Oh, another question. Sorry.
So as a data center engineer new to the QA environment, I only have really a major concern with wondering how we're going to qualify and prove AI and machine learning is fit for its intended use in a pharmaceutical manufacturing environment. How are we going to say that either healthcare provider data or even the manufacturing data can be ingested and manipulated, managed, however AI and machine learning utilizes it, to be utilized for GXP purposes and GXP decisions. Is the process of creating models validated? Is the models qualified? Is the tool qualified as part of the process? Do you go through data integrity assessments and all of that as part of the agile risk assessments and V-model qualification process?
Absolutely. So it starts all the way as you described with the data. Jer mentioned we used historical data from Lilly. This data was annotated, was reviewed by medically trained professionals. So we had a level of comfort in the data. And we also knew that the outputs of the machine would be reviewed by a human being, so they would be providing feedback on it. Data was validated. Second, the models that we built, we have a very thorough framework on, we know what the FDA would look for when you're trying to push those models into production. We have a framework that we follow for making sure that the models are documented. We understand why we did what we did. Like why did we pick deep learning over like a traditional machine learning approach or a rules-based approach. And in some cases, we have an ensemble approach. We have rules, machine learning, deep learning running in parallel. So we have a very thorough process of validating and making sure that we pick the right models. The models are documented. And the last part is the output. It's not just the models are running in production and no one's monitoring it. There's a team that's constantly monitoring the models, making sure that the outputs, the predictions from the model are in line with what we would expect. And we not only do that from a technical point of view, we also do it from a user point of view. We constantly talk to our users to identify if they are seeing any anomalous outputs. So it's not just looking for like your F1 score. We are also looking for user input to identify whether the models are performing the way it's intended to. So it's a very thorough process, and then we have the feedback loop in place. I can talk about that a lot more, but it's a pretty thorough process starting from data, model building, model validation, and then the user feedback back.
Yeah, and we, as Sid mentioned, we do have a full validation package that we can produce upon audit or inspection as well.
Yeah. I think that manufacturing question is a good one because that's a highly inspected process as well. This is a very highly inspected function. I mean, I don't know how many inspections you get a year, but it's many from many different regulators. So we have to have the documentation. It has to be well documented and qualified. And the other thing, we typically, actually, when we started the project, we were worried about the regulators. Like, what would FDA say? What would the MHRA say? We were extremely pleasantly surprised that the FDA, some of the thinking is more advanced than what we are doing here. They're thinking about machine learning, artificial intelligence much more strategically than we would assume they would. So that's been very helpful. So the FDA is also pioneering a lot of approaches. They're very open to understanding what companies like Lilly and others are doing so that they can inform and get better at the way they audit people. Because they see this coming. This is inevitable. Good question. Any others before we hop ahead to some other use cases? All right. So I'm just going to maybe talk through very quickly a couple of different use cases, and we're going to do a kind of a deeper dive into the architecture and talk about how we created the pipeline. So when you think about the example that we used, the fundamental is there's an ingestion engine that gets the information into a data pipeline and an automation pipeline. That is a fairly generic type of a pipeline, but it's aware and understands medical terminology. It understands things like dosages of drugs and events. And what if we use this to apply to other healthcare use cases? So one that we're currently working on using Transcribe, now that we have Transcribe Medical, that will be even more relevant, is using it for call center. So the big problem in the call center within a healthcare company is somebody might call a number for a completely different problem than the agent is set up to handle. They may call for a complaint about the product. They may call for a question about how to use something. They may call for reimbursement. They may call just to have a chat. We get a lot of that, especially depending on the type of drug. So the agent has to be able to understand and triage this, right? If they have the ability to not have to enter this information, to focus on the call and to also be able to get cues, from the machine learning and from some of the NLP, as to how to send the call to the right person, it's going to make their job a lot more efficient, and it's going to take a lot of stress out of the system. Because what's going to happen is if they do things wrong, they get in trouble for it. If they have some assistance, and if they don't have to type everything into all these fields in Salesforce, for example, that's going to fundamentally change their job. And it's going to make the customer, the person on the other end of the phone, a lot happier because they don't have to be routed to 7 different departments. They get to the right place the first time. So that's just another example of using the exact same pipeline, putting on another component like transcribe, and solving a different business problem. So pretty powerful. You know, and again, it doesn't necessarily have to be about adverse events. It can be about complaints. Another example that we're applying it to in the payer industry is, just a quick show of hands, who has ever had a claim that you made to your health insurance company denied? Yeah. If you ever had made any claims, you probably have had one denied. So that's a very frustrating process. I don't know how many times you've had to go back and forth with the insurance company. I think it averages about 7 times before resolution. And the resolution usually doesn't go in your favor. So you're spending lots of time interacting with them saying, why didn't this get reimbursed? Why, you know, and they give you all these reasons. You don't understand these reasons. So what we're trying to do is apply this technology to that type of a call situation where you have an angry customer who doesn't necessarily understand what their contract or what their insurance is providing, and it's going to be able to give the information to the agent to explain it right the first time. The reason why these 6 or 7 interactions have to happen before the case is closed is because the person taking the call typically doesn't have all the information in front of them. But if they can say, if you can get your doctor to provide this information about how they treated you, if you can then prove to us that this procedure was done, then we're good. All of this back and forth could be accomplished at one time because the person receiving the call understands exactly the documentation that needs to be provided. Right now, that just doesn't happen. So it's about surfacing information to the call center agent so they can give it to the person the first time. So that's just another application of exactly the same type of a setup in AWS. Different use case, but because we've trained it to understand medical terminology, because we've trained it to understand what the person on the other end of the phone needs to focus on, that can be solved with exactly the same pipeline. And then one final one. You know, these are interesting from a call center perspective, but if you think about healthcare, there's lots of other issues, and one of the major issues outside of just the, you know, taking calls is information flow. There's too much information coming in and out of most companies for them to handle it well. We're looking at taking this and applying it to data, so data from a clinical study. Data coming into a company typically takes a lot of people to understand, is it complete? Is it in the right format? Did it actually meet the requirement for what I needed? Meaning, does it make sense? So we're applying the same technology to look at data coming into a company and understand if it's of the right value, of the right quality, of the right hygiene, and then be able to move it down to a step where it's ready for analysis. That's a much more technical application, but super important. If you looked at within your company how many people spend time on ingesting and understanding data before it's being used to analyze, it's a very large number. So those are just some examples of how we can approach different problems in healthcare with the same technology. So let's now get into a couple of the deep dives, and I'll turn it back to Sid and JR.
Yep. So just going back to some of the technical side now, we have like approximately 10 minutes or so left. What we want to talk to you about in the next couple of slides is it's a deep dive into a generic AI-enabled automation platform, how it would look like. So this is a real example. We typically get comments like this, or we get questions like this. A text comes in with, say, the patient suffered from diarrhea once a month and was later admitted to hospital complaining of severe stomach cramps. So it's an unstructured piece of text. In the olden days, before advent of AI or advent of intelligent automation, a trained clinician, a trained physician would have to actually go and review this piece of text, extract key entities like diarrhea, stomach cramps, as adverse event, manually key it into a database, and then make decisions to say, hey, is this something I've seen before? Is this a serious event? Is it a non-serious event? But what we have been able to do with an automated information flow is automated. And the reason why we bring this slide up is I want to make sure you understand AI is not magic, right? So it's not just we have a cool machine learning model that's running and spewing out magic. This is an example. We brought this up because it shows how we use rules-based engines, how we used some standard statistical machine learning models, and also we have a deep learning model that work in conjunction to produce the outputs. So for example, the first step here, which is medical text classification, that is based on a rules-based engine. So we have a rule which says that if you extract a piece of information from a section in the text, it's in medical history. That's a simple rule. You don't need any machine learning for it. Once you do that, we have 3 NER models running in parallel. And again, going back to the practical aspect of AI, NLP NER is in my mind, an often hyped technology. You can never rely on one single engine to produce the accurate results that you need for a production-based system. And we found that out early on based on some of the POCs that we did. So for the NER, we typically would recommend employing 2, maybe 3 engines running in parallel, extracting information, and then you have a deduplication layer on top of it to surface the final output. So rules-based engine, then you have NER. One of the NER models is Amazon Comprehend Medical, which works really well. We have an ontology-based model, and we also have a custom-built deep learning model, all working in parallel. Third, definitely not the least, once we have extracted the information, we are able to automatically code this information. Right now, it's being coded to Medra, but we can code it to ICD-9, ICD-10, any of the medical coding applications that you see. This is an example of a deep learning model that we have. So just want to walk you through these slides to first of all emphasize that AI is not magic. We need multiple layers of rules. You need multiple layers of machine learning, in some cases deep learning, all working in conjunction. And at the end of this, let's not forget the user perspective. This is under the hood, right? The user doesn't see this. We showed you an example of the user interface up front in the slide. That's what the user interacts with. They are not concerned about which AI system or which machine learning system, which machine learning model gave their outputs. They just look at the final outputs and provide feedback. And we do a lot of back-end curation to make sure that we update the models accordingly. So this is just an example of how this all works together.
Any questions about the NLP approach before we move on a little bit to the architecture?
Okay, perfect. So the architecture. So when you're talking of an AI-enabled platform, this is how we would typically design an architecture. It goes from left to right. On the left-hand side, you have all your data sources coming in, right? You have your issue tracking system, your call center data, you have PDFs, you have some handwritten text coming in. And we have a bunch of ingestion services running. And since this is built on AWS, using a completely event-driven serverless architecture, we have a combination of step functions and Lambda functions, which ingest data as it comes in. We store the data in an S3 bucket, and then we run a bunch of transformations on that data. Transformations on the data that are customer-defined. So we, again, have a combination of step functions and Lambda functions that help us with this transformation. So it's completely serverless, 100% serverless architecture. We have Lambda functions, step functions helping us with the transformations. We have provision for things like audio transcription. So Amazon Transcribe Medical, if we want to use it, we can just plug it in. We have provision for translation, not just from Amazon, from any services. We have image processing. We have provision for using image processing models, which can be easily plugged in, and we can get the outputs accordingly. So that's the pre-processing. And then, of course, you have NLP as one of the machine learning models that are running. We have other rules-based engines and other deep learning models running, which help us with the interpretation of the data. So you ingest, you transform, you read it using NLP, and then you interpret it using a combination of machine learning and deep learning models. And then finally, the front end, which is also built on Heroku, which is on AWS, that's how we surface our outputs. So the user just sees the front end, right? And there's a lot more. This is, you have a discovery sandbox where our data scientists go in and just explore. They identify what models to use. They do their experimentation, which I hope will be a lot easier once we start using SageMaker Studio that was just announced yesterday. But there's a lot more to it. But at a high level, this is how the architecture looks like. You pull in data using a completely serverless-based architecture. You transform it. You pre-process it. you run it through your models, and then you surface it into a user interface. And once it's all done, once the user has provided feedback and we are ready and we are comfortable with the case, we just push it to a downstream Oracle-based system or any other downstream database that's on-premise for reporting purposes. So let me quickly pause here and see if we have any questions, because one of our goals here is to make sure you understand that implementing AI in the enterprise, it's easier said than done. A lot of it is just cultural changes. A lot of it is technological changes. But it's doable, and the results are real. I'm sorry, yeah, you had a question.
Yeah, so you mentioned you're in a regulatory environment, and one thing that caught my eye was the HIPAA-compliant cloud-native technologies. So could you speak to it from a perspective of this architecture slide, and what are some decisions you had to take to ensure that you are, in fact, a HIPAA-compliant solution, especially when you moved into a cloud environment like Amazon?
Go ahead. Sure, I can get started. So as you guys know, Amazon or AWS will tell you their services are HIPAA eligible. So we have to make sure, as in the companies have to make sure that they're compliant and you're comfortable with it. So, and we have a team sitting here that helped us with it. We started with HIPAA compliant services, HIPAA eligible services, and then keep using Lily's framework of validation and compliance. We were able to conform to the HIPAA compliance from a Lily perspective. So we had some inbuilt frameworks or in-house frameworks from Lily. JR, if you want to just.
Yeah, and a lot of this, I mean, we are doing it. We don't technically have to abide by HIPAA compliance for purposes of public safety, but we are following all the same standards, protecting the data, right, and also abiding by GDPR compliance as well when patients call us and want their information removed. So we are providing for that capability as well.
Thank you. We've got about 3 minutes left. Any final questions?
Question.
So you mentioned that FDA was very positive in the technology and AI. How are insurance companies reacting to it? So insurance companies, both from the insurance company of me as a consumer and as well as the medical providers' liability insurance?
Yeah, I would say that our interactions with the insurance companies, they're very measured, meaning they're not wanting to necessarily, as a group, kind of jump into the machine learning and automation area. They're very comfortable with rules-based automation and RPA. They've been doing that for a long time. When you start to talk about machine learning and intelligent automation, many of them are just not ready to do that. Many of them are not even comfortable putting their data in the cloud yet. So there's several steps that have to happen before I would say the insurance industry, health insurance industry, is going to be comfortable or mature enough to adopt this kind of technology. I think there's going to be early adopters. That's who we're working with, early adopters that are willing to take the risk, just like Lily was able to, and had a lot of success. But I would say that's definitely not pervasive. So I don't want you leaving here thinking all health insurance companies are going to start using this kind of technology. There's a ways to go. But there are early adopters, and you're going to see in the next probably 3 years larger adoption of cloud, which will lead to more solutions like this. Great question. Any final questions before we wrap up? So what we'll do is we'll have some members of the team up front here if you want to ask any specific questions, or if you thought the questions would be too hard for the people on stage, the real smart people will be standing here to take your questions. And thank you guys for joining. Appreciate it.